Bloom and Ang explain that the dramatic changes in family formation are characterized by a reduction in marriage rates, the overall effect of racial and economic inequalities on marriage rates, and the rise of non-marital cohabitation. Carr and Utz observe that dramatic changes in family formation are explained by the reduced likelihood of adults aging with their first spouse and the exponential rise in divorce, remarrying, formation of cohabitation partnerships, and people choosing to be single. The authors note that the formation of step-families provides both challenges and opportunities, especially for the psychological and biological well-being of aging adults. Carr and Utz maintain that 70% of men and 46% of women at the age of 65 or older are married. 60% of men and 17% of women above 85 years are married. The authors associate the gender gap in marriage with men's lower life expectancy, the increased likelihood of women to be widowed, and men's tendency to marry younger partners and choosing to remarry after divorce or widowhood. Dush and colleagues explain that the rates of entering the first marriage have significantly gone down, a phenomenon that is clearly marked by levels of education and race. The authors, in presenting the theory of demographic transition, associate the drop in the rate of marriages with the recent rise of valuing self-actualization and individual autonomy, especially among educated individuals. The ideational theory, guided by the increased use of oral contraception and the sexual revolution, maintains that as societies become more educated, economically developed, and secularized, focus shifts from fulfilling basic to secondary needs, such as autonomy and self-actualization. The focus of marriage has moved from maximizing union efficiency to optimizing personal satisfaction. The outcomes of overly focusing on self-actualization and autonomy include decreased religiosity, increased fluidity in gender and sexual behavior, delayed marriage, increased cohabitation, union dissolution, the spread of non-marital sex, and the acceptance of single parenthood. The accelerated adulthood theory focuses on the socio-economic disadvantages that differentiate the stability of unions. On the one hand, young adults with fewer resources present greater likelihood of shorter, informal cohabitation unions. On the other hand, young adults with resources delay union formation, but these unions are more likely to be stable. Dush and colleagues note that low-income youth enter into unions for the economies of scale, including sharing living expenses. Bloom and Ang foresee declines in the probability of marrying, especially within the black community compared to whites and other races. This projection, the authors argue, is based on the fact that marriage decline is greatly reported among people from low-income backgrounds, with these people being disproportionately black because of opportunity denial and discrimination. Declines in marriage in the black community remain that case across parental incomes, with racial differences in marriage occurring among people with similar socio-economic backgrounds. The authors observe that familial inequalities translate into both racial and economic inequalities that transition across generations. The panel study of income dynamics of between 1969 and 2013 uncovers that men's reduced economic prospects and a rise in incarceration rates has significantly reduced the rates of entering into first marriages. Obviously, incarceration rates disproportionately affect the black community, but we'll cover the statistics behind that in a different video. Societies have dramatically changed over the recent past, with these changes being evident in the double standards surrounding male and female sexuality fading over time. Teenage engagement in sexual activity, pregnancy and birth are posing very serious issues to societal structures around the world. These issues are also raised by the sharp rise in births to unmarried women and cohabitation relationships. Notably, Akerlof and colleagues maintain that the percentage of births to unmarried women has more than doubled over the recent past to 64%. Marriages have also been threatened, with this threat revolving around the normalization of divorce. The popularization of public engagements or proposals has been perceived as a modern approach to restoring the glory of marriage and committed unions, but it is evident that there is so much more that needs to be done. Various theories have been used to explain the rate at which marriages are declining all over the world. Most of these theories revolve around cultural, economic, and demographic factors. Particularly, the drop in marriage rates is linked to the decline in men's economic prospects, an accompanied rise in economic prospects for women, the cultural shift of prioritizing economic stability before marriage, the reduced attractiveness of lifelong commitments, and the availability of sexual activity outside marriage, which in turn takes away the need for commitment. The availability of sexual activity outside marriage and the growth of the adult film industry, which are linked to a reduction in the necessity and desirability of marriage, have been cited as controversial contribution to the reduction in marriage rates. Oliveira notes that there has been a mixed trend around divorce in America, with cases rising at the rate of 3.5 per 1,000 in the 60s, around when female choice and privacy caught momentum through the invention of oral contraception and the subsequent removal of all barriers to accessing the same, stabilized in the 80s at 5.2 per 1,000, and started to decline at the turn of the century at 4.0 per 1,000 around 2001. These numbers translate to annual divorce rates of 33% in the 70s, 50% in the 80s, 60% in 1997, and 47% in 2001. Amato observes that 50% of first marriages and 60% of second marriages end in divorce. Rayleigh and colleagues maintain that the increased risk of divorce after the first one holds true even when controlling for the level of education, age, and race. Amato maintains that between 1960 and 1980, the divorce rates went from 2.2 to 5.2 per 1,000, which signified a 136% increase. The rates dropped to 3.6 per 1,000 in 2006, signifying a 31% decline, which is associated with the rise in the age of marriage. 42% of Hispanic and non-Hispanic white divorce within the first 15 years of marriage, while the rate is 55% for blacks owing to cultural, structural, economic, and historical factors. Miretsky and colleagues argue that wives report lower marital satisfaction than husbands. Wives' marital and interpersonal functioning contributes to marital conflict or wellness. Higher education reduces the risk of divorce. The risk of divorce is higher at 3 years, 7 years, and after children leave the nest. The paradox of initiatives that seek to slow down divorce rates is the fact that fewer people are committing to marriage, more people are cohabiting, children are being brought up without the benefit of a union, people are forming unions later on in life, and same-sex marriages are on the rise. Also, there is an upcoming culture of later marriages, low birth rates, increased abortion, freezing embryos in storage, and a rise in the formation of temporary unions. Rayleigh and colleagues observed that the median marrying age for men in the 90s was 26.1, while it was 23.9 for women. In 2003, the age was 27.1 for men and 25.3 for women. Correlation is used in reference to facts, attitudes or behaviors that statistically predict an outcome. Correlation doesn't always imply causation, but it definitely translates to increased likelihood of a phenomenon occurring. For example, defying social norms informs the willingness to cohabit and divorce, instead of cohabitation contributing to divorce. Oliveira divides the correlates of higher divorce rates into demographics, behaviors before marriage, and behaviors after marriage. Demographics are concerned with an individual's background, and they include parental divorce, parental perceptions of divorce, growing up in single-parent households, getting married at an early age, poverty, unemployment, and generally a negative view of life. Behaviors before and after marriage are more dynamic than they are stable because they can be acquired or dropped. The behaviors before marriage that correlate with higher divorce rates include premarital sexual relationships, cohabitation, pregnancy, and childbirth. The behaviors after marriage include problematic communication patterns. These patterns include negative interpretation of partner actions, escalation, stonewalling, withdrawal, defensiveness, criticism, contempt, low commitment, a weak sense of togetherness, infidelity, drinking, and substance abuse. The laws and policies surrounding premarital sex and cohabitation focus on disease and pregnancy, while they ignore the impact on marital stability. Human sexuality today is perceived and presented as a product of adult sexual desires, with the underlying consequences such as diseases and unwanted pregnancies almost being ignored. This phenomenon is greatly associated with the availability of contraception and abortion services, which has increased the opportunities of sex without the commitment to long-term unions. The premarital correlates of higher divorce, especially sex and cohabitation, are widespread behaviors for most societies around the world. Feiner explains that by age 20, 77% of the respondents in the 2002 National Survey of Family Growth reported having had sexual intercourse, 75% had premarital sex, 12% were married. By age 44, 95% of the respondents had had premarital sex, that is, 94% of women and 96% of men. 81% of those who had abstained by age 20 had had premarital sex by age 44, 82% of women who turned 15 between 1954 and 1963, as well as 91% of women who turned 15 between 1964 and 1993 had had premarital sex by age 30. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, The percentage of ever-married women between ages 15 and 44 who report having had premarital sex went from 84.9% in 2002 to 88.8% in 2015. Paik observes that since 1988, approximately one-third of teenage American girls between 15 and 17 reported having already had their first sexual experience. The interest in adolescents' sexual debut is based on the fact that it is linked to the overall number of lifetime sexual partners, sexually transmitted diseases, and teenage pregnancy. Norouzi and colleagues identify sexual awareness, religious beliefs, child economic support, parental interaction, and parenting practices as some of the concepts that contribute to engaging in premarital sex. Adolescent sexual behavior is a serious concern because of the prevalence of HIV, STDs, and unwanted pregnancies. Diseases such as genital warts, chlamydia, and gonorrhea are more common among teens and young adults. The authors maintain that comprehensive studies across Northern America and Europe show that 50% of women report having engaged in intercourse by age 17, with the number going to 70% by age 20. A study by Ali and Naidu uncovered that 70% of the sampled Seventh-day Adventist youth endorsed the Church's stance on premarital sex, while 54% engaged in premarital sex. Diamond observes that half of American Christians maintain that casual consensual sex among adults is sometimes or always acceptable. Particularly, 62% of Catholics, 56% of historically black Protestants, 54% of mainline Protestants, and 36% of evangelical Protestants report that casual sex is acceptable. 84% of the religiously unaffiliated, 94% of atheists, and 95% of agnostics report that casual sex is sometimes or always acceptable. This table by Lauman and colleagues shows that the percentage of people engaging in premarital sex has dramatically gone up between 1933 and 1974. On the one hand, 32.6% of men had engaged in premarital sex around 1933, while this number went up to 69.8% around 1974. On the other hand, 30.7% of women engaged in premarital sex around the 1930s, with the number going up to 57.7% around the 70s. Teachman maintains that a quarter of women born between 1950 and 54 experienced their first sexual encounter in their marriage. This number dropped to 10% between 1965 and 69. Rayleigh and colleagues observed that by the age of 18, 69% of boys and 76% of girls report already having been involved in a romantic relationship within the last 18 months, with the relationships for half the adolescents lasting over 21 months. Twenge and colleagues observe that the acceptance of same-sex relationships, adolescent sex, and premarital sex went up between the 1970s and 2010s, but the acceptance of extramarital sex went down. The changes in sexual permissiveness have been more common among whites, and less common among racial minorities and women in general. 29% of Americans, that is, 35% of men and 23% of women, believed premarital sex was not wrong at all in the 70s. 42% of Americans in the 90s believed premarital sex was not wrong. 55% of Americans, that is, 59% of men and 52% of women, in the 2010s believed that premarital sex was not wrong. Among those aged 18 to 29, 47% of boomers in the 70s, 50% of Gen Xers in the 90s, and 62% of millennials in the 2010s reported that premarital sex is not wrong at all. The acceptance of same-sex relationships has also increased, with the rate of acceptance being 21% in the 70s, 26% of Gen Xers in the 90s, and 56% of millennials in the 2010s. The general acceptance of sex was accompanied by a rise in the rates of casual non-committed or non-partner sex, especially for those between 18 and 29, from 35% of Gen Xers, that is 44% of men and 19% of women, in the 80s to 45% of millennials, that is 55% of men and 31% of women in the 2010s. The number of sexual partners has also increased from 7.17, that is, 11.42 for men and 3.42 for women, in the 80s to 11s.2, that is 18.22 for men and 5.55 for women in the 2010s. Smith and Son observe that the disapproval of premarital sex has declined from 34.2% in 1972 to 21% in 2012. However, the level of disapproval of teenagers, that is 14 to 16 years, having sex has remained constant at 2/3 or 66% over the years. The disapproval of extramarital sex increased from 70.5% in 1980 to 83.3% in 2008, and dropped to 80.8% in 2012. The support for the legalization of pornography increased from 57.3% in 1973 to 68.6% in 2010, and later dropped to 66.6% in 2012. The consumption of pornographic material has also gone up from 16% in 1980 to 24.6% in 2012. The disapproval of homosexuality dropped from 75.6% in 1987 to 43.4% in 2012. Interestingly, Oliveira argues that sociologists categorize America, Ireland, and Poland as sexually conservative. Particularly, 29% of Americans believe that premarital sex is always wrong, while 41% say it is not wrong. 40% of American females and 30% of males believe that premarital sex is wrong in 1985. The author asserts that in Great Britain, only 12% believe premarital sex is wrong, while 70% believe it is not. When focusing on teenagers, 91% of women and 85% of men report the belief that premarital sex is wrong. A survey by the National Campaign to Prevent Teenage Pregnancy uncovered that 55% of teenage boys, 72% of teenage girls, and 58% of teens above 17 wish they waited longer before they engaged in intercourse. Sedge and colleagues documented adolescent, that is 15 to 19 years, pregnancy, births and abortion rates across 21 countries. The authors maintain that America has the highest teenage pregnancy rates at 57 per 1,000, while Switzerland has the lowest at 8 per 1,000. The rates were highest in Mexico and sub-Saharan African countries. Hungary reported the highest rate of unwanted pregnancies for girls aged 10 to 14. The proportion of teenage pregnancies that end in abortion ranged from 17% in Slovakia to 69% in Sweden. Longili maintains that 10% of teenagers report having had intercourse by age 15. This table shows the rates of teenage pregnancies in Canada, United States, and the United Kingdom. The rates of teenage pregnancy between 1994 and 2002 reduced in North America, while it increased in the United Kingdom. The author associates the decline in teenage pregnancy in America with an increase in the use of oral contraception from 32% to 49%, decline in contraception non-use from 34% to 18%, and decreased sexual activity. Contraception use also contributed to the decline of teenage pregnancy in Canada, with 39% of 9th graders and 54% of 11th graders reporting contraception use. England reported the highest abortion rates, followed by America, then Canada. The choice of being sexually active and using contraception is linked to community, extrafamilial, intrafamilial, and individual level factors. Individual level factors include drug use, future expectations, beliefs, attitude, and knowledge. Intrafamilial factors include socioeconomic status, parent-child communication, and family structure. Extrafamilial factors include health services, sex education, and peer pressure. Community-level factors include values surrounding teenage pregnancy. Longili explains that babies born to teenage mothers are at greater risk of being underweight, experiencing infant mortality, hospital readmission, growing up under less supportive environments, poor cognitive development, and being parents as teenagers. According to the World Health Organization, 21 million girls aged 15 to 19 years in developing countries end up pregnant every year, with 12 million giving birth and 770,000 girls under the age of 15 giving birth. Adolescent mothers present greater likelihood of eclampsia, puerperal endometritis, and systemic infection, with the babies born to adolescent mothers being at greater risk of neonatal health conditions and low birth weight. In the least developed countries, 39% of girls are married before their 18th birthday and 12% before their 15th birthday. Pregnancy and child-related complications are the leading causes of death for girls between 15 and 19 years, with low- and middle-income countries accounting for 99% of the global maternal mortality rates. According to the CDC, the overall birth rate for females aged 15 to 19 years declined from 61.8 births per 1,000 in 1991 to 26.6 in 2013. The rate for teens aged 15 to 19 years fell 62% from 1960, when the birth rate was 89.1 per 1,000 women, and 44% from a rate of 61.8 in 1991 to 34.3 in 2010. Most of the decline in birth rates for teens occurred from 1960 to 1980 and then again after 1991. Decreases in birth rates for teens aged 18 to 19 years generally were greater than the decreases for teens aged 15 to 17 years from 1960 to 1978. From 1991 to 2010, decreases in birth rates for teens aged 15 to 17 years were greater. 37% of the births in America are unintended, and this number has not declined significantly since 1982. Women in their 20s report the highest rates of abortion at 56.9%, with 92.7% of abortions taking place before 13 weeks, 6.2% occurring between 14 to 20 weeks, and less than 1% after 21 weeks of gestation. Medical abortion before 9 weeks increased 123% between 2010 and 2019. The rise in cohabitation has been accompanied by increase in premarital sex because the two clearly overlap. The primary reason for cohabitation is testing the strength of union and if individuals could get along in union before making the actual commitment. According to Jose and colleagues, cohabitation eliminates the legal confines of marriage and the option of remaining single, thereby enabling individuals to play the line between single and married. Basically, cohabitation is a marriage prototype, but the irony is the fact that it is a significant contributor to divorce. Teichmann observes that marriages preceded by cohabitation are 50% more likely to be dissolved. Increased cohabitation reinforces the decline in the prestige of family status. Sassler and Lichter explain that changes in the timing, duration, and sequencing of cohabitation relationships has raised the complexity of studying marriage. While most young adults cohabit before marriage, most cohabiting unions do not end up in marriage. The number of ever-married Americans in 2018 was 68%, down from 77% in 1950. 59% of the married population ranged between 18 and 34 in 1978, with this age range accounting for 29% of marriage in 2018. This is an indication of the significant delay in the formation of marital relationships. The median marrying age for women is 27.8, while for men is 29.8. Marriage rates have declined from 8.2 per 1,000 in 2000 to 6.9 in 2017. First marriages have declined over time, while remarriages form a significant number of all marriages. Non-marital cohabitation has significantly replaced marriage. The number of cohabiting couples in America increased from 1.6 million in 1970 to 8.5 million in 2018. 14.8% of adults between 25 and 34 years are living with an unmarried partner, with those living with a married partner being 40.8%. The number of women between 19 and 44 years who have ever cohabited has grown from 33% in 1987 to 60% in 2015. Less than three-quarters of adult men in their 40s in France, Netherlands, and Germany have ever married. This number for men aged 45 to 49 is 74.1% in Japan, 73.5% in Denmark, 68% in Norway, and 64.1% in Sweden. Overall, Sassler and Lichter observed that three-quarters of all American adults have ever cohabited, showing the increased acceptance of cohabitation and its use as an alternative to marriage. Lichter and colleagues assess the impact of the first birth on the stability of cohabitation and marital relationships. 1 in 5 births are associated with transition into cohabitation or marriage, while 1 in 4 births are to cohabiting women and 60% of all non-marital births occur in cohabiting relationships. Teichmann observes that approximately 60% of marriages in the 90s began with cohabitation, compared to 10% of the marriages that were preceded by cohabitation between 1965 and 1974. Jose and colleagues argue that the number of cohabiting partners between 1970 and 2000 went up 10 times from 500,000 people to 4.9 million. The authors maintain that more recent data suggests that half of ever-married women have cohabiting histories, 75% of married couples in Australia cohabit before marriage, and 90% of Norwegians cohabit before their first marriage. Dush and colleagues observe that 1/3 of women had cohabited in 1987, 2/3 of adult women had cohabited in 2013, while 70% of women who got married between 2010 and 2014 had a history of cohabitation compared to 40% of those who got married between 1980 and 1984. Eichmeyer and Manning maintain that people born in the early 80s report 50% more likelihood of cohabiting and twice or more likelihood of cohabiting after the first cohabitation was dissolved, a phenomenon termed as serial cohabitation. Koppen and colleagues assert that 48% of women involved in their study between 2006 and 2010 cohabited with a partner as a first union, with the number being up from 34% in 1995. 70% of women with anything less than a high school diploma had cohabited with their partner, compared to 47% of women with a bachelor's degree or higher. 40% of the first premarital cohabitations among women transitioned into marriage by 3 years, 32% remained intact, while 27% ended in dissolution. 20% of cohabiting women experienced pregnancy within their first year of cohabitation. Alvey asserts that there were 3.8 million cohabiting Americans at the turn of the century and projected that the number would increase to 1 in every 7 married couples by 2010. In a span of 20 years between the 70s and the 90s, the number of unions preceded by cohabitation moved from 11 to 50%, with the median duration being 1.3 years, 40% of the couples breaking up after a year, a third lasted 2 years, 1 in 10 lasted 5 years, and 41% of cohabiting couples had children. The author maintains that combining parental conflict, divorce, and cohabitation influences the undertaking of risky sexual behaviors by children who use cohabitation as a determination of compatibility. The author argues, based on the Monitoring the Future survey of 1998, that while 73% of boys and 80% of girls report the perception of a stable and happy marital life as important, only 28% of girls and 38% of boys believe that marriage brings more happiness than cohabitation or staying single. Besides, 67% of men and 59% of women perceived cohabitation as a great idea. Jose and colleagues also support that a good number of young adults perceive cohabitation before marriage as a good idea.